He went out to celebrate the 4th of July with friends. 2 days later, he washed up on the shore of Horn Island, dead. And more than 3 weeks later, his parents still don't know how or why. This is the case of Nolan Wells. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what investigators, forensic experts, and the family's legal team say does, and doesn't, add up. Before we go further, this case is moving fast, with new developments breaking almost weekly. If you want to stay with this story, as the evidence comes in, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next update. Nolan Wells was 18 years old, a football player and student at Southwest Mississippi Community College. On the morning of July 4, 2026, he left from a private dock near Ocean Springs with a group of friends on a boat trip to Horn Island, a remote, uninhabited barrier island about 10 miles off the Mississippi coast. According to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the boat left the island to head back to shore at 9:56 that morning, without Nolan. His mother, Christine, reported him missing that night. 2 days later, on the morning of July 6th, his body was found in the water. Since then, the case has drawn national attention, not just because of how Nolan died, but because of everything that's happened since. His family has hired attorney Ben Crump, one of the most prominent civil rights lawyers in the country, along with attorneys Eric Hertz and Lisa Park. And in the weeks since Nolan's death, their legal team has raised a series of specific, evidence-based questions about how this investigation has been handled. Let's start with the timeline. On the day Nolan's body was found, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter told reporters that detectives were interviewing people who had first-hand contact with Nolan that day, and that no foul play had been identified at that point. But Nolan's family, and the legal team representing them, say that conclusion came too fast, before some of the most basic forensic questions had even been answered. There's also a real dispute about what actually happened in Nolan's final hours on the island. Some reporting has indicated Nolan may have chosen to stay behind after his friend's boat left. Nolan's parents have publicly disputed that account, pointing to witnesses who say they saw him on the island after the boat departed. Investigators have also said they're looking into online reports of an alleged altercation on the island that day and whether it involved Nolan, and they've specifically asked the public for original, unedited photos and video from July 4th. None of that has been confirmed publicly as fact. It's part of what investigators say they're still trying to piece together. One of those questions involves the location where Nolan's body was recovered. According to attorney Crump, oceanic engineering experts have been consulted to examine how tidal movement in that area works. Because, he says, investigators claim Nolan's body was found in essentially the same spot where he was last seen alive. For a body in open water over a 48-hour period, that raises a question. With the tides shifting between low and high during that window, does that location actually line up with what we know about how water moves in that area? That's a question the family's team says is still unresolved, and it's part of why they've brought in outside oceanic experts, rather than relying solely on the initial findings.
And so we want to know how.
Then there's the independent autopsy. Dr. Roger Mitchell, a forensic pathologist brought in by the family, didn't get access to examine Nolan's body until July 10th, 6 days after his death. By that point, according to the family's legal team, Nolan's airways and lungs had already been dissected during a prior examination. That matters, because the presence or absence of water in the lungs is one of the clearest physical indicators of whether someone drowned. Once that tissue has already been altered, it becomes much harder to independently verify. Dr. Mitchell has also been public about a broader point, that determining Nolan drowned doesn't actually answer the central question of what happened to him. Was he conscious when he entered the water, or unconscious? Did he go in voluntarily, or was he forced? Those are the questions Dr. Mitchell says still need answers, and a drowning finding, on its own, doesn't resolve any of them. On July 22nd, the results of that independent autopsy were made public. Dr. Mitchell's official finding, Nolan's cause and manner of death are undetermined, pending further investigation. In his written report, he pointed to specific limitations. He couldn't directly examine the airway and lungs for water, or the stomach for its contents, because that tissue had already been altered by the time he got access. Toxicology results from both the independent autopsy and the state medical examiner's office were still pending at that point. In other words, nearly 3 weeks after Nolan's death, there was still no official, confirmed cause of death. There's also the matter of Nolan's throat. According to the family's attorneys, tissue from Nolan's throat was missing from his body by the time it was transferred for the independent autopsy. That's a detail the family's legal team has flagged directly, and it's one of the specific items they say they want addressed as the investigation continues.
So we are going to dot every I and cross every...
No specific findings from that analysis have been made public yet, but the fact that outside forensic audio experts have been brought in signals the family's team believes there may be more in that recording than what's already been discussed publicly. So where does the official investigation stand? According to attorney Eric Hertz, the family's legal team has been in direct communication with the district attorney's office. They've reportedly reached a tentative agreement to have phone records, not just belonging to Nolan's friends, but multiple phones connected to the case, reviewed jointly with both the prosecution's experts and the family's experts involved. Hertz has also said he expects the FBI to be present for that review. That detail matters. A joint review with federal investigators involved and experts from both sides examining the same evidence is a meaningfully different posture than a case that's already been quietly closed. It suggests there are still open threads the official investigation hasn't fully run down. By late July, Sheriff Ledbetter said his office had interviewed around 60 witnesses and that the FBI was assisting with digital evidence. The 3 friends who were on the boat trip with Nolan have been interviewed at length and have retained their own attorneys. And Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath has said that once the investigation wraps, she plans to bring the case to a grand jury to decide whether any charges are warranted, meaning the official process is still ongoing, not closed. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because the way this case has been described publicly has shifted over time. In the first days after Nolan's body was found, the sheriff's office put out a statement saying, "No foul play was suspected." That single phrase became the center of enormous public backlash and speculation online. Weeks later, a law enforcement analyst brought on to explain the case to CNN suggested that phrase may have simply been a poor word choice, that what the sheriff likely meant was there were no immediate, obvious signs of foul play at the scene, not that the case had been ruled out or closed. The sheriff's own coroner reportedly described it in similar terms. Whether that's a fair read of the original statement or a walk back after the fact is something people can judge for themselves. But it's a real example of how quickly early language in a case like this can take on a life of its own. Around the same time, the sheriff's department also confirmed it was investigating reports of an altercation on the island on July 4th. One local outlet, WXXV, reported that it had spoken with an eyewitness who said Nolan was not directly involved in that altercation, but the sheriff's office has continued to ask anyone with information about it to come forward, so even that detail remains unresolved. There's also the question of why this case drew national attention in the first place, beyond the unanswered forensic questions. CNN's reporting has noted that some of the speculation and distrust around the case is tied to Mississippi's history on race, and to the fact that in photos from the trip, Nolan appeared to be the only black teenager among his friend group. The Reverend Al Sharpton, who has stood with the family at multiple press conferences, has said publicly that the family isn't bringing in race for its own sake, but that the circumstances, combined with how the initial statement was worded, are part of why the family and their supporters have pushed for an outside, independent investigation rather than accepting the local conclusions at face value. None of this proves anything one way or the other about what happened to Nolan, but it does help explain why a case that started as a missing persons report over a holiday weekend turned into a national story with civil rights attorneys, the Congressional Black Caucus, and international headlines within a matter of weeks. If you're finding this breakdown helpful, take a second to subscribe. We cover cases like this one carefully, sticking to what's actually documented instead of jumping to conclusions. And there's more of that coming as this case develops. It's also worth noting how this case has intersected with two others. At the same National Urban League press conference where these updates on Nolan's case were shared, Crump's legal team also discussed two other cases. An 18-year-old named Daniel Irvin, whose death in Texas is also being examined for inconsistencies in how it was initially investigated, and an 18-year-old named Tyler Smith in Kentucky. Crump has said all three cases occurred within a roughly 3-month window around the same holiday period, and that part of the reason he's elevated Nolan's case is that public attention on it has encouraged witnesses in the other two cases to come forward as well. None of these cases have been publicly confirmed to be connected to one another, but the family's legal team has been explicit that raising Nolan's case has had a ripple effect. More people calling in tips, more witnesses willing to talk. Not just in Nolan's case, but in the others. The family's attorneys have been careful, publicly, to frame this as a search for answers. So, with all of that laid out, what actually still needs answers? First, cause of death itself. Nearly a month after Nolan died, there is still no confirmed official cause of death. Not from the independent autopsy, not from the state medical examiner. Toxicology results from both sides were still outstanding as of the most recent public update. Until those come back, the word drowning, which has been used informally by investigators and in early coverage, remains a working theory, not a finding. Second, the condition of Nolan's body between when he was found and when the independent pathologist finally got access to it. 6 days passed. In that window, tissue that could have answered whether water was present in his lungs was already altered. That's not necessarily evidence of wrongdoing. Autopsies proceed on their own timelines, but it is a gap that makes independent verification harder, and it's one the family's team has flagged directly. Third, what actually happened in the hours between when the boat left Horn Island and when Nolan's body was recovered 2 days later? Investigators have said they're still trying to reconstruct that window, including requesting original photos and video from anyone who was on the island that day. Whether there was an altercation, whether Nolan was alone, whether anyone else was still on the island with him, none of that has been publicly confirmed. Fourth, the contents of the original 911 or emergency call audio and what the family's audio engineering experts find when they finish their independent review. That analysis hadn't been made public as of the most recent update. And fifth, whether the tidal pattern in the area is actually consistent with where Nolan's body was recovered relative to where he was last seen. A technical question, but one that could either support or undercut the working theory of what happened. None of these are accusations. They're the specific, documented gaps that investigators, the family's independent experts, and reporters covering the case have all pointed to. A grand jury will eventually decide whether any of this amounts to criminal charges. Until then, these are the questions that remain open. So where does that leave things? Investigators initially concluded there was no foul play. The family's independent forensic and legal team has raised specific, documented questions about the timeline of the autopsy, the condition of the body when it was examined, the tidal patterns at the recovery site, and the contents of the original emergency call audio. None of those questions have been publicly answered yet. A joint evidence review involving both sides' experts, and reportedly the FBI, appears to be moving forward. What's confirmed? Nolan Wells left to celebrate the 4th of July and never came home. What remains unverified? Everything about how and why. If additional records, forensic findings, or official updates become public, they'll provide a clearer understanding of what happened. Until then, the evidence that has been released can only answer part of the story. If you appreciate evidence-based true crime analysis, not speculation, not sensationalism, just the facts as they're confirmed, subscribing is the best way to support that kind of coverage, and it makes sure you're notified the moment the grand jury decision or new forensic findings come out.